It all started on a normal Saturday night. I was sitting on my bed, scrolling through my phone, half watching some random movie playing on TV. My bedroom was like any other teenager's room, cluttered with clothes on the floor, a few posters on the walls, and a big old mirror mounted on the closet door that I barely paid attention to. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular, just enjoying a typical evening. The house was quiet. My parents were downstairs watching TV, and my younger sister Lucy was asleep in her room. The only sound was the faint hum of the ceiling fan and the soft murmurs of the movie in the background. I don't know what made me look up, but suddenly my eyes drifted toward the mirror. At first, nothing seemed out of place. There I was, sitting cross-legged on my bed, my reflection staring back at me like it always did. But something felt off. I couldn't explain it, but it was like there was a slight difference between me and the reflection. Something subtle, just out of reach. I leaned forward, squinting at the glass. For a moment, everything seemed fine. My reflection copied my movements, tilting its head in the same way I did, blinking at the same time. Then it happened. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as my reflection didn't. While I sat perfectly still, the reflection shifted, just a little. It was barely noticeable, but I saw it. My reflection's head moved ever so slightly, even though I hadn't moved at all. "What the?" I whispered, my voice barely a breath. I stared harder, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It had to be a trick of the light, right? Maybe my eyes were tired from staring at the screen for too long, or maybe I had just imagined it. But then, the reflection moved again. This time, there was no denying it. The reflection's hand twitched. Its fingers curled in on themselves, slowly, almost as if testing whether I'd notice. A wave of cold dread washed over me, and my skin prickled with goosebumps. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. It was like my eyes were glued to the mirror, and my body refused to move. The reflection was no longer mimicking me. It was doing its own thing, independent of my actions. And that's when I realized. It wasn't me in the mirror anymore. It was something else. Something darker. The shadowy figure that had once been my reflection started to take shape. It was still vaguely human, still wearing my clothes, still shaped like me. But it wasn't me. Its face seemed to darken, the features blurring and shifting until it was just a dark, twisted version of me. Its eyes turned black, hollow pits, and its smile. It wasn't my smile anymore. It was wide and crooked, stretching too far across its face, revealing teeth that were sharper and longer than anything human. I wanted to scream, but my voice was stuck in my throat. My heart was racing so fast it hurt, and my hands trembled as I gripped the edge of the bed. The shadow thing in the mirror started to move again, more deliberately this time. It stood up, mirroring the way I had been sitting on the bed just moments before. Slowly, it began to walk toward the front of the mirror, its dark eyes locked onto mine. Its movements were slow and jerky, like it was still figuring out how to use my body. I forced myself to tear my eyes away from the mirror, my body finally responding to the panic that was bubbling up inside me. I scrambled backward off the bed, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand. My back hit the wall, and I clutched at the doorknob, desperate to get out of the room, away from whatever was in that mirror. But when I looked back, the shadow had stopped moving. It stood right in front of the mirror now, its dark face pressed against the glass, its black eyes watching me with that awful smile still plastered on its face. And then it started to tap. Its fingers, a twisted, elongated version of my own, began to tap on the glass, slowly at first, then faster, like it was trying to get my attention. The sound echoed through the room, a soft but persistent clicking that made my skin crawl. I knew I had to get out of there, but something kept me rooted to the spot. I watched in horror as the thing in the mirror began to press harder against the glass, as though it was trying to push through. Tap, tap, tap. It leaned closer, pressing its face so hard against the glass that I could see the cracks beginning to form around its mouth. The glass splintered in tiny spiderweb patterns, the sound of it breaking mixing with the tapping, growing louder and louder until it was almost unbearable. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted for the door, yanking it open and practically flying down the hallway. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I slammed into the living room. My parents looked up from the couch, startled by my sudden entrance. "What's wrong?" my dad asked, sitting up straight, concern etched across his face. I could barely form the words. There's something in the mirror," I stammered, my voice shaking. My mom frowned, standing up and walking over to me. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice gentle but confused. I shook my head, trying to explain. "It's not me. It's something else. It was moving on its own. It's trying to get out." They exchanged a worried glance, and my dad stood up, walking over to me. "Show me," he said firmly. I didn't want to go back in there. Every fibre of my being screamed at me to stay far, far away from that room. But I had to show them. I had to prove that I wasn't crazy. Together, we went back to my bedroom. My dad pushed the door open cautiously, and we all stepped inside. The mirror was normal. The reflection was just that. My reflection. There was no shadowy figure, no cracks in the glass. Everything was exactly as it should be. I stood there, my heart still pounding in my chest, my breath shallow. It didn't make sense. It was there. I had seen it. I had heard it. "Are you sure you weren't just dreaming?" my mum asked softly, placing a hand on my shoulder. I shook my head. "I wasn't dreaming," I insisted. "I saw it. It was real." My dad sighed, rubbing his temples. "Maybe you're just overtired," he suggested. "It's late. Why don't you get some sleep? We'll talk about it in the morning." I didn't argue. I didn't know what else to say. I was so shaken, so confused that all I wanted to do was crawl into bed and forget about the whole thing. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see it. The dark figure in the mirror, the crooked smile, the hollow eyes. I could hear the tapping, the persistent, awful tapping. When I finally did fall asleep, it was restless. My dreams were filled with shadows and whispers, with cold hands reaching out from the glass to pull me in. I woke up in a cold sweat more than once, my heart pounding so loudly in my ears that it drowned out everything else. The next morning, I avoided the mirror. I couldn't bring myself to look at it, not after what had happened. My parents brushed it off as a bad dream, but I knew better. I had seen something real, something evil, and I wasn't about to go near that mirror again. But as the days passed, I couldn't escape the feeling that it was still there, lurking just beneath the surface of the glass, waiting for the right moment to break through. And every night, as I lay in bed, I could swear I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. The sound of something trying to get out. Something waiting for me to look into the mirror again. Something that wasn't me. And I knew deep down that it wouldn't stop until it found a way to cross over. It started a week ago. I'd always been a light sleeper, so when the phone rang at exactly midnight that first night, I was awake instantly. Groggy and a bit annoyed, I fumbled for the phone on my nightstand, squinting at the glowing numbers on the alarm clock. 12 a.m. on the dot. "Who calls at this hour?" I muttered to myself. I picked up the phone, hesitating for a split second before answering. Maybe it was an emergency, someone needing help. The thought woke me up a little more. "Hello?" I said. For a moment, there was nothing but silence on the other end. I was about to hang up when a voice, a strange, flat voice, spoke. "They're outside your window." The words sent a chill down my spine. I sat up straight, my heart beating faster. What? Who is this? I asked, trying to keep the edge of fear out of my voice. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my mind racing. It had to be a prank, right? Some idiot making creepy calls in the middle of the night for fun. Still, the unease lingered. I got up, tiptoeing to the window that overlooked my front yard. Nothing. Just the street lamp casting a dim glow over the quiet neighborhood. The wind rustled the trees, and the rain that had been falling earlier had left the ground damp and shiny. There wasn't a soul in sight. I let out a breath I didn't know I had been holding and told myself to forget about it. It was probably a bored teenager pulling a prank. I shook my head and went back to bed, but it took a long time to fall asleep. The next night, it happened again. At exactly midnight, the phone rang. This time, my pulse quickened as soon as I saw the clock. I didn't want to answer, but something made me pick it up anyway. The same strange monotone voice greeted me, sending a wave of dread through my body. I checked every room, every corner, every closet. Nothing. The house was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was there with me. The air felt heavier, like the house itself was closing in on me. I went back to the living room and stayed awake until morning, too scared to fall asleep. On the 6th night, I decided not to answer the phone. I sat on the couch, staring at the clock as it ticked closer to midnight. My hands were clammy, my stomach knotted with anxiety. I knew the phone was going to ring, and I knew somehow that whatever the voice was telling me, it was getting closer to the truth. 12:00 a.m. The phone rang. I didn't move. I didn't answer. It rang again, and again. I clenched my fists, trying to ignore it, but the ringing seemed to echo through the house, growing louder with each second. For a long moment there was only silence. Then I heard it. A faint creak, like someone stepping on a loose floorboard. The sound came from the hallway, just beyond my sight. I could feel my pulse in my ears, my breath shallow as I strained to hear more. Creak. It was closer this time. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen counter and slowly made my way toward the hallway, my hand trembling as I pointed the light into the darkness. The beam wobbled as I moved forward, casting shaky shadows on the walls. I checked every room, every corner, every closet. Nothing. The house was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was there with me. The air felt heavier, like the house itself was closing in on me. I went back to the living room and stayed awake until morning, too scared to fall asleep. On the 6th night, I decided not to answer the phone. I sat on the couch, staring at the clock as it ticked closer to midnight. My hands were clammy, my stomach knotted with anxiety. I knew the phone was going to ring, and I knew somehow that whatever the voice was telling me, it was getting closer to the truth. 12:00 a.m. The phone rang. I didn't move. I didn't answer. It rang again and again. I clenched my fists, trying to ignore it, but the ringing seemed to echo through the house, growing louder with each second. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, it stopped. I exhaled in relief, feeling like I had passed some sort of test. But then the knocking started. At first it was soft, a gentle tap, tap, tap on the front door. My heart leaped into my throat. I turned slowly toward the door, my body frozen in place. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. I grabbed the phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking so badly I could barely press the buttons. I told the operator someone was trying to get into my house. They promised to send a police car right away, but it felt like they would never get here in time. The knocking stopped, replaced by silence, so thick I could hear my own heartbeat. I didn't dare move. I didn't even breathe. And then the voice returned. Not through the phone this time, but from outside. It was the same voice, the same flat, emotionless tone I'd been hearing every night. "They're inside again," it said. "They're standing right behind you." I spun around, the flashlight trembling in my hand, but there was nothing there. The room was empty. The voice continued, now seeming to come from everywhere at once. "They're closer now, almost close enough to touch you." I backed up against the wall, feeling trapped. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. I wanted to scream, but no sound would come out. Just then, the sound of sirens cut through the night. Blue and red lights flashed through the windows as the police arrived. I ran to the door, throwing it open and stumbling outside. The officers met me on the porch, their hands resting on their guns. "There's someone in my house," I cried. "I've been getting these calls every night. They're inside, they're—" The officers exchanged a look before one of them gently took me by the arm. "We'll check it out," he said. "Stay here." I waited on the porch, shaking from head to toe as the officers searched the house. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Finally, they came back out, their faces calm. "There's no one in there," one of them said. "The house is empty." I stared at him in disbelief. "But the calls, the knocking, they said they were inside." The officer shook his head. "We didn't find anything unusual, but we'll keep someone nearby tonight, just in case." I nodded, though my mind was still racing. How could it be empty? I had heard them. I had felt them. As the officers left, I stood on the porch, the rain beginning to fall again. I looked back at the house, its dark windows staring back at me like empty eyes. The phone didn't ring again that night, but somehow I knew it wasn't over. Whatever was happening, it was still out there, and it was getting closer. It was only a matter of time before it found me. When we first saw the house, it seemed like a dream come true. A large, 2-story Victorian-style home with a wraparound porch nestled at the end of a quiet street in the small town of Morrowville, Georgia. My wife Sarah and I had been looking for the perfect place to raise our 2 kids, Jake and Emily, and this house with its spacious rooms and charming details seemed like the perfect fit. It was old, yes. The floors creaked in places, the paint was chipped on the edges of the door frames, and the windows rattled in the wind. But that was all part of the charm. The realtor had mentioned that the house had a history, but we didn't ask many questions. It was old, after all. Old houses always had stories, and we weren't worried about any of that. We were just excited to have a home to call our own. We moved in during the fall. The air was crisp, and the leaves had just started to change colors. The kids were thrilled with the idea of exploring the big house, and Sarah and I were happy to finally be settling down after months of searching and moving. Everything seemed perfect, at least at first. The first few nights were quiet. We were exhausted from unpacking, so we didn't pay much attention to the little noises that came with an old house. The wind outside, the creaks in the floorboards, the groans of the old pipes, all of that seemed normal. But on the 4th night, something changed. I had just climbed into bed when I heard it. A faint sound, almost like someone whispering. I sat up, listening. It was so soft that I thought I might have imagined it. Sarah was already asleep beside me, her breathing steady, and the kids were tucked away in their rooms. I figured it must have been the wind outside, or maybe a draft sneaking through the old windows, but the sound persisted. It was coming from the walls. I got up, moving quietly through the house, trying to track down the source of the noise. The whispers were so quiet, like they were barely there, but I could hear them, just on the edge of my awareness. I pressed my ear to the wall in the hallway, straining to make out the words. But it was like they were in another language, or maybe just too low for me to fully understand. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. After all, we'd been working hard all day. Maybe I was just tired. I went back to bed, determined to ignore it. The next morning, I mentioned it to Sarah, but she brushed it off with a smile. "It's just the house settling," she said. "Old places like this make noise sometimes. You're probably just not used to it yet." I nodded, though something about it didn't sit right with me. But I didn't want to worry her, so I let it go. That night, the whispers returned, only this time they were louder. I could hear them more clearly now, not just a faint sound, but actual words, though they were still too garbled to understand. They seemed to be coming from the walls again, moving from room to room, as though something or someone was walking through the house, whispering as they went. I wasn't the only one who noticed it this time. "Dad?" Jake's voice came from the doorway of our bedroom. He was standing there in his pajamas, his face pale. There's someone talking in my room." My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "I heard whispering," he said, his voice trembling. Like someone was standing right next to my bed, but when I looked, no one was there." Sarah sat up beside me, her expression concerned. "It's just a dream, Jake," she said softly, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She didn't believe it was just a dream any more than I did. I got out of bed and took Jake back to his room, checking every corner, every closet, making sure nothing was out of place. The whispers had stopped by then, and everything seemed normal. But as I tucked him back in, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that maybe there was something in this house that we didn't understand. Over the next few days, the whispers grew more frequent. They started earlier in the night, lasting longer each time, and they were getting louder. What was once just a faint, almost unnoticeable sound had now become a constant, low murmur that filled the house after dark. It was impossible to ignore. And then, the nightmares started. Jake and Emily both began waking up in the middle of the night, screaming. They told us about terrible dreams, dreams of dark figures standing over their beds, of shadows moving through the halls, of voices calling their names in the dark. Sarah and I did our best to comfort them, but it was hard when we were dealing with our own fears. The whispers were getting to both of us too. I could see it in Sarah's eyes, the way she looked over her shoulder whenever we walked through the house, the way she jumped at every little sound. One night, as I lay in bed, unable to sleep, the whispers came again. But this time, they were different. They weren't just random words and sounds anymore. They were saying something that sent chills down my spine. "They know," the voice said, clear and unmistakable. "They know what you're afraid of." I sat up, my heart pounding. It felt like the walls themselves were speaking to me, like the house was alive, feeding on our fear. I wasn't sure what to do. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave, but where would we go? We had put everything into this house. It was supposed to be our home. The next day, I decided to do some research. I went to the local library and asked about the history of the house. The librarian, an older woman named Mrs. Porter, seemed hesitant to talk about it at first. But after a little convincing, she told me what she knew. The house had belonged to a family years ago. A couple with 2 young children just like us. But something terrible had happened. The father had gone mad, convinced that the house was haunted, that the walls were speaking to him. One night he locked his family inside and set the house on fire. But they never found the bodies. I felt sick as she told me this, the pieces falling into place, the whispers, the nightmares, the sense of being watched. It all made sense now. The house wasn't just old, it was cursed. And whatever was in those walls, it wasn't finished with us yet. That night the whispers were louder than ever. They filled the house, echoing through the halls, taunting us with our deepest fears. I heard my own voice, twisted and cruel, whispering all the things I was afraid of, losing my family, losing my mind. Sarah heard it too. She started crying, holding on to me like she was afraid I might disappear. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the whispers stopped. The house fell silent, an oppressive stillness settling over everything. But I knew it wasn't over. The house was waiting for us to break, for us to fall apart under the weight of its dark past. We didn't sleep that night. None of us did. We sat together in the living room, the lights on, the door locked, listening for any sign of the whispers returning. By morning, we had made up our minds. We couldn't stay here. The house had its hold on us, and if we didn't leave, I was certain it would destroy us. We packed up what we could and left the house that same day. We didn't look back. The whispers may have been silent when we left, but I could still feel them lingering in the back of my mind. It's been a few months since we moved out. We found a new place, a smaller, newer house on the other side of town. The kids are doing better, the nightmares have stopped, and the whispers are gone. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and everyone else is asleep, I think I can still hear them, a faint, barely there whisper coming from the walls. And I wonder if we ever really escaped at all.